Okay, everyone, welcome to another New Jersey Constitutional Republican virtual conversation. It's my great privilege today to have my good friend, Professor John Schaff from Northern University in beautiful South Dakota. Professor, welcome.
Great to be here again. Good to see you.
Of course, the professor has his deer hunting beard, his goatee ready to go. It's cold out there in South Dakota, so he's got a new look, and we like that look. I said it looked like an NHL playoff beard, but he's looking good.
Well, I don't have hockey hair. I'm not really capable of hockey hair anymore, so I got to go with the hockey beard, I guess. So
that makes me think of the old New York
here than I can up here. So
that makes me think of the old, and I'm going to date myself, but makes me think of the old Ron Duguay of the New York Rangers, who had the beautiful flowing hair.
Duguay,
yeah, Ron Duguay was he was really a Hollywood special. I know that my friend Michael Patrick Carroll, a longtime conservative assemblyman up in North Jersey, would appreciate that reference, being a big Ranger fan.
Well,
I'm more of a devil.
I'm originally from Minnesota, and it's still a thing every year at the Minnesota High School Hockey Tournament. There is the all-hair team, and it is a thing for these guys to grow the biggest, ugliest mullets they can possibly grow, and hockey hair is real serious in my home state of Minnesota. But again, I am long since past the ability to grow my hair in that fashion. I would look even dumber than I look now if I try to do something like that. So.
And what's interesting, Professor, is there is a connection between New Jersey and Minnesota and South Dakota in one Zach Parise.
Yes.
And of course, his father, JP, was a great New York Islander. Yep. And Zach, I had the pleasure of meeting Zach the first year he was with the Devils, and he was a great player for the Devils, a real class fellow. And of course, he went back to home to become part of the Minnesota Wild. And didn't he attend South Dakota U? Wasn't he one?
No, he was at University of North Dakota. University of North Dakota is a big hockey school. Hockey is not as big in South Dakota, but University of North Dakota is a big hockey school, which we don't need to talk too much hockey, but the irony is that his father, JP, was an assistant coach for the University of Minnesota for quite some time.
Right. And of course, he's with the North Stars.
Yeah, and coached a lot in Minnesota, and which is why, Zach Parise's from Minnesota, because his dad, JP, had been a coach with North Stars and with Gophers, and then he ended up at the enemy, the enemy school, University of North Dakota. So.
Right. And of course, JP played with the Minnesota North Stars.
Yep. Back in the day.
Prior to coming to the Islanders, and he made a real name for himself. And he's very well respected and well liked player amongst the players who I've had the opportunity to know over the years, being an avid hockey fan. But anyway, let's get down to talking about this great book that you've written. Here's a picture of that book, Professor. Do you have the book?
I got it right here. I come prepared.
Yeah, come prepared. Now, there's the color version of it. Yeah. But the book is Abraham Lincoln's Statesmanship and the Limits of Liberal Democracy. This book couldn't have been written, Professor, at any better part in really our history, because we need to look back to Lincoln. Of course, the whole impetus behind creating the New Jersey Constitutional Republican movement was to restore the party back into the image, intellect, benevolence, moderation, prudence of Abraham Lincoln. We believe that the party now is ripe for this, and it's time that we do this. And I know that we have two gubernatorial candidates here in New Jersey. Doug Steinhardt has announced, and Jack Ciattarelli has been working hard already. And both of these men are Lincolnian. They love Lincoln, especially Jack. He's a real fan of Lincoln and reads about Lincoln quite a bit and is very influenced. But both of them are very respectful of Lincoln. Of course, we hold Lincoln in the highest regard. And we think that your book brings out a lot of the points that need to be stressed again by Republican representatives. So we talked about the first chapter quite a bit, prudence and moderation. I just want to read a segue for you to go off and explain a little further Of course, the ideals of prudence and moderation were very, very important, because those virtues of moderation and prudence help mitigate the vice to which democratic government is most prone, namely the blind worship of majority rule. The democratic statesman must cultivate these virtues to a high degree. Lincoln understood that a democratic statesman cannot safely ignore public opinion. Rather, it was that leader's task to shape that opinion towards justice. Talk about that, Professor. Very profound remark.
Yeah, well, and it's the whole idea here, and I think we could probably use this, to segue and a little bit to talk about natural rights, is that the purpose of democratic government is that we think that the purpose of government, according to the Declaration, I think we talked about this last time. Purpose of government, according to the Declaration, is the protection of natural rights. So when it says to secure these rights, governments were instituted among men, right? That tells us that this is the purpose of government. And we seem to think that a government based on consent of the governed, some kind of majority rule, is one of the essential ways. It's not the only way, but it's one of the ways in which we protect natural rights, because people are naturally jealous of their own rights, and they seek to defend those. But we also know that majorities can be wanton, they can be misled, they can be ignorant, in some ways. So what's the old definition of democracy? Is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. So we know that, and also to a certain, whatever justice there is behind majority rule, and there's obviously a great deal of justice behind it, but it's also, in one way, majority rule is simply an expression of power. So we want that expression not just to be an expression of power, but to be an expression of justice. And so that's why we have to think about how we frame our institutions, how we conduct our elections. Something that's in the air these days, of course. How do we conduct our elections? And then what is the character of the people who lead us? And are they the kind of people who will take kind of a longer view and help inspire the people to look beyond their immediate self-interest to maybe, looking out for the good of the public, common good of the next generation? We've talked about a little bit of, it's not just about what I can get today, but what is this going to do for the future? And that, so when the majority expresses itself, it expresses itself in a way that's consistent with justice. And the main thing there is also is expressing majority view while respecting the rights of the minority. And so the idea that people in the minority can feel comfortable with majority rule, knowing that the system in which we live, in which we govern ourselves, is one that is going to respect minority rights. And that way, even if I'm in the minority, I can trust the majority, because I know they're not going to invade my rights for all sorts of reasons. But one of those is a statesman who makes the right kinds of appeals and helps shape public opinion towards a common good and towards the protection of natural rights.
Right, and this is very this hits home here in New Jersey, Professor, because of course we have a democratic rule. They rule all branches of government, and they really don't take into consider the minority rights in regards to natural rights. With all of the executive orders that have been passed down, using the this pandemic has really it's been very indicative of clear infringements on the civil liberties of many of the people of New Jersey, with many businesses going out of business. There's been a loss of life with regards to people being placed in convalescent centers that shouldn't have been placed there, hurting other people, all directed from the government, from the health from the Health Organization of New Jersey, and of course, Governor Phil Murphy. So we're seeing in many ways majority tyranny, to where the majority doesn't believe that the majority has their best interest in heart. And this is, of course, this is a crisis in many ways. And this is why it's so important that we elect someone like a Lincoln who shows the prudence and the moderation and wants to positively affect the public opinion. As Lincoln said, that, you know, the public sentiment is what's as important, and that's going to drive the political, that's the purpose of government. But it really doesn't, in this day and age, there's a lot of polarization between the two parties, and everybody's voting down party line, and they have their party agenda, and that's all they care about. And we clearly see that with the Democratic Party here in New Jersey. So it's important that people understand that government was supposed to be set up. Lincoln understood the importance of the minority and protecting their natural rights. It's not happening in New Jersey.
Yeah, and the whole idea is, you know, when we form our majorities, we want those majorities to be based on consensus and moderation and take into account multiple points of view. And it's no problem you get. And we have this in some states. Well, in my state, it's the opposite. It's the Republicans who dominate everything. Even though there are certain, you know, and Democrats would say the same thing in New Jersey. There are certain benefits that come from that, but it's the idea of are you thinking about, when you've got such a dominant situation, how can you build consensus? And so we have a problem. You know, again, we've talked a bit about moderation versus centrism, and I'm not one who fetishizes bipartisanship. I think political parties exist for a reason. And if anything, I believe in stronger political parties than we have today. I think our political parties are weak, but nonetheless, there is something to be said for a kind of moderation or centrism where there's a little bit of give and take between the parties. And, you know, you don't always get, you know, even if the majority, if they know that there is a possibility they could lose on a vote or lose an election, then they're less likely, sort of, you might say, to push the point, and they're gonna stay their hand a little bit. And one thing that's happened, you know, in some states, sounds like New Jersey is one of them. As I pay attention to the news, I know something about what's going on in New Jersey, New York, and California seems to be a great example of this. Is you know, when we look at a pandemic, is a great example of what we've been talking about last couple meetings about moderation. There's so many things that go into how we deal with pandemic, and some states it's a very narrow definition of health that rules the day, and in anything to push this narrow definition of health. Whereas what we know is that health encompasses all sorts of things. That, you know, if people can't work, they're not healthy, right? If kids can't go to school, they're not healthy. If people can't say hi to mom, they're not healthy. I mean, in person, right? They're not healthy. When families can't come together, when friends can't come together, when kids can't play with each other, when we can't work. You know, I'm lucky enough that I'm still working. I haven't had any furlough, but I know lots of people, right? Small business people and students, right? When restaurants close down, right? When those service jobs take a hit, who gets hit the most? It's you know, low skilled labor, which is often high school kids, college kids like we got here, are the ones who have those kinds of jobs, these part-time jobs, and that's not health either. And so it's trying to again, to create a majority that is trying to, you know, take into account all parts of a coalition, that we moderate and come together, and, you know, try to respect the interests and the rights of as many people as we possibly can.
Right. And a couple of things that become very obvious, Professor, in New Jersey is the fact that Governor Murphy has acted unilaterally in his decision making. He has not incorporated any input from the state house or for state senators or the assembly. He's only dealt with the Department of Health and the state troopers. And that's basically, and maybe his attorney general. but he does not act. And this gets to the point we'll talk about in future episodes of progressivism and the idea that the executive branch is more powerful than what the Constitution really applies to the executive branch. That's number one, is unilateral action. And the other thing that's become obvious, Professor, is the fact that the laws and the legislature needs to clearly define what constitutes crises and wars and pandemics, and what specifically can be done really in reining in the power of the executive branch in this example, because the legislature needs to put a clamp on these unilateral decisions, these executive orders that Phil Murphy has imposed. Same thing in New York with Cuomo, and same thing in California with Newsom. So we really see the excesses, if you will, of liberal democracy being concentrated in the power of the executive branch, in this case, our governors, to act unilaterally and to be uninhibited in what they are essentially legislating. And they're not given that responsibility of lawmaking.
Look at the great line that Justice Gorsuch used in that case from a couple weeks ago out of New York. I can't remember the name of it, but about the closing of businesses when the court put a moratorium on these executive actions by Governor Cuomo, and Justice Gorsuch said, during a pandemic, the Constitution might take a holiday, but it can't take a sabbatical, right? At a certain point, it's got to stop, right? So what we see in a lot of cases with governors and presidents is you take, what did President Obama, well, it wasn't him, it was Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's chief of staff, who famously said, never let a good crisis go to waste. That was in response to the economic crisis of 08, 09. And a lot of governors are kind of never let a good pandemic go to waste. And so you, at some point, and I guess the Supreme Court has done a little bit of this, and it probably will take legislators and at some point voters to push back. And we all agree that a pandemic is a crisis, but there's a certain point where there's got to be, like, some give and take. And I think we talked about executive actions a little bit last time too. And the problem, as you sort of indicated with Governor Murphy, with executive action, is that these decisions that have to be made in our crisis are decisions that affect all sorts of people and all sorts of interests, and those have to be talked out and balanced, and there has to be deliberation. And when the executive just acts, that deliberation doesn't happen. I know we all get frustrated sometime at the legislative process because sometimes they talk some things to death, but there's a reason why we have committee meetings. Right. There's a reason why you have floor debate, and that is you get witnesses at committees, you talk to people, you amend a bill. Here's something we didn't think about. Here's an expert that says, this is why this is stupid and why this is great. And here's a citizen who says, you guys might not realize it, but this thing you're doing, this is good over here, but it's killing us over there. Maybe there's a way we can reconcile that. And that only comes out through discussion and through deliberation. And when, whether it's a governor or the president who just says, I'm going to do it with the stroke of a pen, as Mr. Obama once said, I have a telephone and a pen. I can just make law, essentially, is what he was saying. And that is inconsistent with the kind of deliberation that we're talking about, which is necessary for the protection of rights. That's why we have separation of powers in the first place.
Right. And in New Jersey, our current state senator, the president of the Senate, he's not, he really doesn't support the idea of deliberation and debate on the floor. The Democrats have their agenda. They want to push it through the committee hearings, and there really isn't an opportunity for a lot of debate back and forth. And of course, that we believe that needs to be restored in our state houses, in our assemblies, and in our national, in the Capitol, to where there is debate, lively debate and deliberation and common sense, using logic and rationale to make law and legislation. And then too, specifically, Professor, we've seen that with these draconian unilateral decisions that the governor has made, specifically in New Jersey and in other states, in requiring people to have to vote by mail and not actually go to the polls. Now we see all of these irregularities in many of these different states, with states now suing other states as a result of really the worst election as far as the perhaps the accuracy of the vote has just occurred, and it's only going to get more and more highlighted. The need, and I wanted to ask your opinion on this. I believe that now is the time for the federal government to actually get a hold of the states and require certain responsibilities given voters and those in the election offices and the boards of elections for setting up proper ID, for making sure that the vote is authentic and that it is accurate, and safeguards with the amount of technology that we have. There's no reason why we can't get good, accurate election results. And this last election clearly shows, and a lot of it has to do with the forced vote by mail campaign pushed by the Democrats, that there are a lot of election irregularities that need to be addressed.
Yeah, I think I for now I'm going to disagree with you only to this much. I like federalism in elections, but what I would say is this: is that now what happened this year is what I hope is a one-off phenomena because of the COVID crisis. And so what happened is, a lot of states sort of changed their rules in midstream, and that is not good. And now you can sort of forgive it for one election cycle because this is a weird election, trying to do an election in the midst of a pandemic. But what we have seen is then if this continues, then I become more convinced that we need federal action. If in 2022, 2024, I mean, I know I've been talking to friends, colleagues about these things. I'm of a certain age. You are too, JR. I guess I can let's just think back to 1996, Clinton versus Dole. I was a graduate student at the time. I voted absentee, which meant I actually went to my county courthouse, filled out a piece of paper while I was at home, because by election day I wasn't going to be there, and they mailed me a ballot. Right. But what wasn't that hard for me to do that? I just did it. Right. If I knew I wasn't going to be in the state when election day came around, so I took care of business. But that was in 1996, as far as virtually nobody did vote by mail, right? There was no early voting, or virtually no early voting, what is now almost ubiquitous, Yet I don't remember anybody up in arms or any, wailing in the streets about the lack of democracy in the 1996 election, right? It all seemed to work out just fine, right? It's
a good point.
I guess I'm just a simple country boy, JR. I don't understand how, when I vote in Minnesota, or in Minnesota, my home state, in South Dakota, I get a piece of paper, I fill in a dot next to the name, it goes in a machine that reads it at the end of the day when the little old ladies go down to the courthouse and they run it through a machine, the county auditor is there, and we get a tabulation. It's not that complicated. And we have a paper record, and it's a very simple ballot. It's very easy to understand. And yet somehow some jurisdictions can't figure out. Part of me goes, I don't know why we went to some of these touchscreen voting machines and all this stuff that we've done, when it seems like these paper things work pretty well. And then we get this worry, this complication. Are the voting machines being hacked? What if they don't create a paper record? Do we know what actually happened with this particular machine? And it just seems like a lot of what we've done in an effort to encourage people to vote. This is always, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's always a balance. We want to make it easy enough for people to vote, but we all know that there's a point where you make it so easy that it encourages fraud. And what happened again with this year, one of the things that happened, because we changed a lot of rules, people don't trust the system, because well, we had this rule, then suddenly it was this rule, and it was kind of slapdash, where you're talking about things about, does someone need to witness my signature on this? Do I have to show an ID? Again, I live in a state where I show an ID in order to vote.
Yes.
So even, I don't know, I had a driver's license at 16. I was just a stupid kid, and somehow I managed to get a photo ID from the government. It's not that hard to do, but we seem to have gotten into our heads that getting a photo ID, like showing up on election day to vote, or if you know you're not going to be there on election day, doing just a little bit of legwork to get your absentee ballot, that somehow these things are beyond the pale. And this constitutes voter suppression to ask people to do what you and I did, and I'm just picking 1996 because it was such a non-controversial election that nobody thought it was weird that this is how we did it in 1996, and now it's, somehow if we look back at 1996, if we use the goggles we have on now, it'd be like we're one step away from fascism when nobody questioned it. And I don't think they had to read that. The whole point is, I don't think we had to question it, because we understood it wasn't that hard to run a fairly operational election system. You don't have to make all sorts of exceptions to the rule, or as they get things so complicated. That I don't know, maybe the 2000 election put a bug in us, and now everyone's so worried about having a 2000 election in Florida again. But it just seems like we've overthought the operation of elections. It really does not have to be as difficult as Americans seem to make it.
Right. And it is, of course, it's not good that people don't have confidence in the election process. And this is why it really needs to be a focus and cleaned up. And we need to make it so that it's fair and accurate. And of course, you talk about 1996, and that was the year my personal favorite vice presidential candidate, Congressman Jack Kemp, was the vice presidential pick for Bob Dole that year. And of course, Jack Kemp is an inspiration to constitutional Republicans and always will be. He was, of course, a great admirer of Lincoln. And let's get back to the book, Professor, where we talk about the 1854 Peoria speech, of course, on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was probably had more to do with the creation of the Republican Party than any other single piece of legislation. And Lincoln, of course, was talking about the fact that, really the speech argues against the notion that there is no right, quote, no right principle of action, but self-interest. And what other principle is there then, if not self-interest? So talk a little bit about that as far as it works with public opinion.
Well, let's, you've struck a chord. Let me do a little history about the Republican Party. Because, you're right, because, it's kind of interesting is that, when, the Whig Party, which is sort of the precursor, I think we'll probably talk about this at some point, but sort of the precursor of the Republican Party. In 1848, the Whig Party elected a president, Zachary Taylor. And then by 1855, at least, so what's that, 7 years later, the party was gone. It almost ceased to exist by that point. At that point, it was replaced. And because in 1854, this Kansas-Nebraska Act introduced to Congress by Stephen Douglas of Illinois, so he would become sort of Lincoln's arch rival, which was a repeal of the Missouri Compromise. And the idea was the Missouri Compromise is, of course, that all the territory of the Louisiana Purchase that was north of, 36, 30, I'm trying to remember the southern border of Missouri, 36, I think it's 36 degrees 30. Everything north of that would be free. Everything south of that was open for slavery. Kansas, Nebraska, that's 1820. Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 repeals the Missouri Compromise, trying to open those western territories that were north of that to slavery. And this really lit the fire. It split the Northern Democratic Party. Some Democrats were for this, some Democrats were against it. There was a strong anti-Nebraska Democrats. It split the Whig Party pretty cleanly north and south. And then all the anti-Nebraska forces came together to form the Republican Party. And like I say, within a year, really, certainly within 2 years, the Whig Party was gone and had been completely replaced by the Republican Party, of which, of course, then Lincoln was a bit of a latecomer to the party. I mean, relatively, it was a little bit later than a lot of people, but didn't take him that long to join the party, literally and figuratively. But then, what's he talking about? Then in Peoria in 1854, which I think really is obviously Gettysburg and the Second Inaugural are really the rhetorical pinnacles of Lincoln's career. But I think if you wanted to get a distillation of Lincoln's political thought in one speech, I think you go to Peoria in 1854, which is sometimes called On the Repeal of the Missouri Compromise. And it's really a great speech. And it's got that line that you quoted, JR, of he rejects the notion that there's no principal impetus of action than self-interest. Because what Stephen Douglas said is that we can repeal Missouri Compromise. We can open the West to slavery. And what we'll do is we'll have this thing called popular sovereignty. As these territories start to incorporate, right, we'll let the people who live there vote on whether they want slavery or whether they don't, right? As opposed to under Missouri Compromise, they had no choice. It was no slavery. That was federal policy. He said, no, we'll just let the people vote. And he said, there probably won't be slavery in these places anyway, because it'll be against their self-interest. I think he was wrong on this, but he said the kind of agriculture that they're going to do there, the kind of people that are going to go to places like the modern states of Kansas and Nebraska, they're not slave people. They're not slaveholders. Don't worry about it. Self-interest will rule the day. And we should just let consent rule. Whatever the people vote, and then he ended up calling this the don't care policy, as in, I don't care whether they vote it up or vote it down, slavery that is, as long as the people have the right to vote on it. And so this is self-interest in two different ways, and this is Lincoln's point, is that even if Douglas was right, that a popular sovereignty policy would in practice end up with anti-slavery Kansas and Nebraska, the principle that we don't care about natural rights is a perverse principle and undermines the very foundations of free government. Remember, Lincoln said that the principles of the Declaration are the axioms of free government, right? And so when we undermine the idea of natural rights, the idea that you and I have dignity that does not come from the government, we have these rights which are inviolable, right, inalienable in the language of the Declaration, and these cannot be voted away because the majority has power and votes my rights away, right? That is a natural injustice. And then, of course, it's self-interest in the second way, in, as I've sort of just alluded to, the idea that whatever the majority wants, the majority should get, and that the only standard of justice we have is whatever the majority wants. And so this is the idea that justice is whatever we desire. And we all know that that's not true. And if there is something true about the human person, that in our nature, we have these inalienable rights, it doesn't matter what the majority says. There are certain things that majority cannot justly do. We cannot justly consent to this, right? So even if it's consent, it's an unjust consent, any more than I as an individual cannot consent to be a slave, right? I cannot consent to let myself be killed by somebody, right? There are just certain things that I cannot justly consent to because they're a violation of who I am as a human person. And then we as a group, there are things that we just cannot justly consent to because they're a violation of natural right.
Yep. Yeah, and then of course you go into the book and you talk about James Madison and the Federalist 51. Of course, he addresses the idea of majority tyranny, and even if the majority votes against natural rights, which in many ways we see the Democrats doing, that still doesn't change the fact that we are given unalienable rights. And then, of course, Lincoln went back to the Declaration of Independence, stopped in Philadelphia on the way to taking inauguration, and said that he never had a political sentiment that was not derived from the Declaration of Independence. And of course, what we're saying, the constitutional Republicans, we're saying that we need to go back to these principles of the Declaration of Independence, and that all of our political sentiments need to come from the Declaration of Independence first. And of course, that talks about natural rights, the laws of nature, nature's God, the consent of the governed, the self-evident fact that all men are created equal. So these are the principles that need to be restored within the Republican Party. Very contrasting, Professor, what the Democrats talk about with everybody needs universal health care. We need to have climate change legislation. We need to have this particular and that particular, whereas we're thinking more universal overall, and guiding, and letting Republicans should be creating policy based on these universal principles like Lincoln did in going back to the Declaration, whereas the Democrats are very, very interested in special interest, in special needs, and special services. And talk about that. And this is what Lincoln went back to.
I think
principles of the Declaration.
There's a question: what do we mean by rights when the Declaration says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men? I think it's fair to say that for the founding generation, they saw this as largely a negative task, and so that means that if you look at, say, the Bill of Rights. Even though Madison said that the protection of your rights in our constitutional order is separation of powers, it's not listing them on pieces of paper, but nonetheless, I'm going to go to that piece of paper, go to the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is largely a list of thou shalt nots, right? Even though the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Right. The Second Amendment says that your right to bear arms shall not be infringed upon. The Third Amendment says they shall not quarter soldiers in your home. You shall not be subject to unreasonable searches and seizures. You shall not be forced to testify against yourself. You shall not be denied a jury trial. You shall not be subject to cruel and unusual punishment, and so on. So it's a list of thou shalt not, right? So there are these negative claims, these things we don't want the government to do, right?
Right.
And so the idea is that rights are not something that can be provided to us by a government, but something that we have that pre-exists government, and then government largely has a negative task of protecting those. Now there is then an argument arises in the 20th century. You see this very specifically in Franklin Roosevelt. You think of things like the Four Freedoms speech, right? Or what he called the New Bill of Rights, right? We have to reinvent this. And the idea here is, and I don't think this is nuts. I think there's actually something to this, right? But it's sometimes a good principle can be taken too far. And Roosevelt's point is that there are certain economic conditions that have to exist prior to our rights making any sense. So it doesn't make any sense to say, oh, you have liberty, right? Or you have the right to have property when you're impoverished, right? And you have, it's difficult to see a way in which you get out of that poverty. It's what good is your right to life when you live in constant illness that you can't? So maybe some minimum level of economic or material conditions have to exist in order for our rights to be put into effect, to be efficacious. Now, whatever, I do think that principle is problematic, but I think that there's at least something to it.
But
then what happens
Professor,
is we take these.
Professor, just let me interject.
Go ahead.
Professor, just let me, because this is very interesting. So we talk about, what can the government provide for the rights to be? So the Declaration talked about to secure these rights, governments are instituted. But what that specifically would look like to the founders, first of all, would be the safety of the person, and then the protection of their property. So that would mean you need to live in an environment where there's law and order, where you can get out and go to work and earn your living, and you can go out and you can safely live your life. And then the idea of protecting your property. You know, if your car gets stolen, you can't go to work. You need to be able to have your property protected. So isn't that essentially what the government should be providing for first, rather than unemployment, uninhibited unemployment benefits and all sorts of different subsidies? Just basic security is really what the founders intended, right?
And so certainly the foundations of a free people are going to be, national defense, right?
Right.
Basic local law enforcement, right? When the bad man comes, I want him stopped, right?
Right.
Integrity. So integrity of my physical person, integrity of my property, and then things such as right to contract. Can I engage in business and have my contracts? And this takes a certain amount of government in order for this to work, right?
Right.
Even such things as property law, right? One of the great things about America is that I'm in South Dakota and I can buy a piece of property in New Jersey sight unseen, because I know you guys have good property law and you keep track of the records, right? And I can see a paper documentation, a paper representation of a piece of property, do an economic exchange with that, and feel confident in what I'm buying, right? And only because we have a certain efficacy of government, strong government, does that work. But I think I think what you're getting at, JR, is that what the founders, the 50-cent phrase is limited but effective government.
Right.
So government has certain ends. To achieve those ends, government needs to be appropriately strong to achieve those ends. That's the complaint that gets us from the Articles of Confederation to the U.S. Constitution, is that the Articles of Confederation were too weak to achieve the goals that we want out of, in this case, a national government.
Right.
What you get was sort of where I was going to go with the Franklin Roosevelt thing, is when you take these sort of kind of preconditions to making our rights efficacious, and you turn those into rights, right?
Right.
What you effectively get is unlimited government, right? Now, not only, Hamilton and Madison both said, where the ends are legitimate, any means are acceptable. But they had limited ends. Government only exists for limited ends. Roosevelt starts, I think there's precursors to this to Roosevelt, but certainly explicitly by Franklin Roosevelt, there really is no principled limit on the ends of government.
Right.
And so the problem when you say, I like healthcare too, and maybe the government needs to do more in healthcare policy. But when you redefine healthcare as a right, what that means is that now I, as a person, have almost unlimited right to your pocketbook to give me healthcare. So healthcare might be a public good, but when we define it as a right, now it's something that must be provided. Healthcare doesn't occur without money. So now we must invade people's pocketbooks to give this thing that we are now redefining as a right. They say, I want to be clear, healthcare is an obvious public good. But when you redefine as a right, now there is an imperative on the part of government to provide this thing. And as we expand our definition of economic rights, then what we do is, in effect, is expand the legitimate ends of government to the point where we could say in our day, there is no principled limit on government, and that's sort of almost the very definition of tyranny. I'm not saying we live in a tyranny, because we have other limits, but what I'm saying is that when there is no principled objection to almost anything the government could do, well then you've certainly got a philosophical problem that we need some statesmanship to help remedy of reducing the people's demands on the government.
Right. And of course, we think, and we'll talk about this in the future, is the significant impact Franklin Roosevelt has had on the executive office. And of course, during that second Bill of Rights, he talked about the right of the people to make a certain wage. And of course, that would bring in a minimum or mandated wage and price controls, which is precisely what had happened and what was done, and in many ways kept the Depression going. So there's an example of government getting involved with what people should be paid. And he also talked about, Professor, the right of the people to recreate. The people should be able to recreate in a certain way. He talked about the fact that everybody should be given a certain degree of education. And of course, if they're providing the education, they're going to dictate what it is that we're going to be educated, and the funding for the education. Of course, that blew up under LBJ's administration to where we have this predicament now with loans and other uninhibited government funding of education. And of course, you're well aware the universities will charge money knowing they're going to get it. So this all came from this idea of this second Bill of Rights. And this is where healthcare, the idea that it's a right to have healthcare. So Franklin Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights really was significantly different from what the founders intended with the second Bill of Rights. And just let me finish by saying, Professor, and we're going to talk about this as we get into your chapter on the progressive influence. And the dichotomy that exists between the Wilsonian, which is really where the Roosevelt, the idea of progressivism, the progressive view of government, in contrast to the Madisonian view of the government, where Madison believed in the structure of the Constitution and the idea of separation of powers being the greatest protector of our freedoms. And he didn't even think that we needed the Bill of Rights. That we just, and then eventually he gave in to believing that we needed the Bill of Rights, because he really thought that the way they had the Constitution structured as far as the three institutions would really be the best protector. And then, of course, today we see the great battle that exists between Wilsonian progressivism and Madisonian's constitutionalism. And this is really the great dichotomy that exists. And we think, Professor, that too many Republicans have gone over to the Wilsonian idea and to the FDR view of more government involvement. And we need to get back to the Declaration and more back to the Madisonian view of the strict construction and structure of the Constitution.
Well, I think what you can, first of all, you're talking about the Constitution. These are, when we look at that famous line from Brothers 51 from Madison, when he talks about the necessity, he says, due dependence on the people is the best limit on government, but history has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. And this is separation of powers is what he means by auxiliary precautions. But also when we're talking about that we can link this together with our Lincoln discussion in this fashion, right? Is that what Lincoln is saying is that the idea of natural rights is a way to limit the demands of the people, to limit our desires, that the purpose of government is not simply to fulfill what I want, but it's got to be consistent with a justice that exists outside of what I or what we want, right?
Yes.
And so, but when we start redefining things, they get our everything that you mentioned is a good thing. Healthcare is a good thing. Education is a good thing. I think unemployment insurance is a good thing, right? Some kind of social safety net is a good thing, right? We might talk about how big, how generous we want that to be, all these sorts of things, but I think these are all good things. But when we define these things as rights, the whole point, as we were just talking about with Lincoln, is a right is something that is kind of non-negotiable, right? It's there in nature. So when we say these things are rights, now we can no longer kind of prudently talk about, well, how do we provide these things, right? How much and what way do we know? Maybe to these folks, not to those folks, right? Maybe this person deserves this help. Maybe this person doesn't deserve this help. But once you define it as a right, well, then everybody's got to get it. And you can't make the sort of distinctions that we want to make in delivering public goods. And so you have to be very cautious about redefining something that might be a good thing as a right, because now it becomes difficult to, kind of split the baby, so to speak. We don't take half of natural right? It's either all or nothing. And so much when we get into kind of this kind of grunt level public policy of things like healthcare, education, social welfare, this needs a lot of give and take, right? And when we're talking about policies that affect entire social classes and the entire social fabric, there's got to be a little bit of give and take in there. And so you just want to be cautious about invoking the word rights, because the word rights, as we're talking about in the American tradition, that's got a lot of power to it. Because if it's a right, then we were saying, the government has to in some way either defend it or provide it, right? And maybe there's some things that we don't want to say the government must provide this particular good, even if prudentially we might say the government has to be involved.
Right. Well, Professor, we've just about been in an hour. It's been a very invigorating conversation, and I hope the audience. I hope that the audience has enjoyed it. I'm sure they have. I would encourage everybody to like and share our videos that we take with the professor. I very much appreciate your time, and it looks like our next episode, if it's okay with you, Professor, would be on January the 8th. No, Christmas Day is 2 weeks.
It's possible I'll be out of state, but we can negotiate that. I don't know my travel schedule.
All right. Well, okay. So, we'll get together. We'll get together. Well, I hope you're going to plan. I hope you're going to plan on coming to New Jersey once the pandemic is over with. We'd love to have you come and join us for a meeting and a talk and give us a lecture that we'd all love to hear. But I really appreciate your time, Professor. And of course, we love this book. Abraham Lincoln, you want to go to Amazon, you want to get this book. And Amazon, there's the good cover. I got short slighted with mine, but the content is what's really important. But I do love the cover. But Abraham Lincoln, Statesmanship and the Limits of Liberal Democracy, written by Professor John Schaff. And we're going to continue to talk about the book. We're not even halfway through it, but of course we go off into many different areas as a result of the conversation. I think that's good, and I think the people are enjoying these lessons. So Professor, Merry Christmas to you and Happy New Year to you.
And everybody in New Jersey, Merry Christmas.
And we'll look forward to seeing you at the start of 2021. And let's remember, Professor, that Lincoln said boldly, liberty for all. Thank you very much.